Fasci's prediction from pre-stack seismic using geological knowledge. So a quick outline of what I'll be talking about today. So one of the big benefits of Bayesian inversion is the integration of information into inversion problem. And I've been to quite a few conferences, and this always seems to come up in that it's really hard to integrate geological information and information from other domains into inversion problems. And I think that Bayesian inversions are a really good way to solve this issue. I'll then go a little bit into the actual nuts and bolts of the Bayesian inversion itself. I'll try not to go too deep. I'll keep it fairly surface level, but there is a couple of specific points on the Bayesian inversion that I like to discuss. So firstly, I'm going to be looking at the prior framework. That's quite an important part of the one-step inversion process. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at the Fasci's modeling as well as the statistical rock physics modeling. And then also, after we look at the prior framework, I'll then discuss the actual inversion step itself. So I do have some examples to show today. I've got two sets of examples. I've got some synthetic examples, which we know are never ideal, but I think are really nice to just showcase exactly how the algorithm works, particularly in corner cases. So just to test exactly that the algorithm is performing as we expect. But I do also have some examples of real case studies that we've completed with this technology. So firstly, integrating geological knowledge. It's a really big challenge, particularly when in companies now where you've got such domain-specific fields. It is really hard to integrate that information, and it is particularly hard to inject that information from a wide variety of sources into a seismic inversion problem. And the way that's been done typically has been through the use of a low frequency or prior model. And if you're not familiar with deterministic AVO inversions or inversions, the prior model basically fills in the gap, or the low frequency model fills in the gap that we don't have in the bandlimited seismic data at the low frequencies. And it also acts as an initial guess of what our elastic properties of the subsurface may be. So traditionally, that's kind of been the way that we've been able to integrate the domain-specific geological knowledge into the inversion problem, if you're only going to the elastic properties, for example. So one big benefit of these Bayesian inversion schemes is that you can integrate knowledge, for example, from this strat chart, which you can see here on the right, about Fasci's ordering, Fasci's thicknesses, and you can do that quite naturally. Another component of Bayesian inversions that are really useful is actually integrating the knowledge that we have of our seismic data. So all of us know that some more than others probably, that seismic data isn't a perfect representation of our subsurface. The processing steps that go into correctly processing seismic data are quite extensive. And we know we have some uncertainties on whether our seismic data is actually representative. So really what we want to do is, can we use this knowledge of our imperfection actually of our seismic data to improve the Fasci's predictions that we have. So for example, you can see here on the right that we have a couple of angle stacks. So we've got 5 degrees, 12 degrees, all the way up to 36 degrees. And this is a very idealized synthetic. And maybe we expect something more like this in our actual seismic data. So we want to see if we can use the knowledge of the noise that we see in our seismic to improve our inversion results. So if you're unfamiliar with inverse problems, basically the whole goal of a seismic inverse problem is to actually infer properties of the subsurface from geophysical measurements. And one really large difficulty with this is that we suffer from the problem of non-uniqueness. So this guy here on the right is a French mathematician. His name was Jacques Hadamard, and he actually came up with some posits on well post problems. And the first thing that he stated for a well post problem was actually that a solution is unique. And we know for a fact that in inverse problems that we deal with a lot of non-uniqueness. That is that many Earth models can actually produce the exact same seismic response that we see. So that's something that's really quite challenging, and why it's quite natural to then formulate the results as a probabilistic result or with uncertainty, because we know that our solution is non-unique. So we can invert the actual seismic data to a variety of properties. So that could be, for example, facies, which we do in this case here, but it could also be, for example, porosity. It could be mineral fractions, for example, like volume of clay, and it can also be water saturations, for example. So traditionally what's been completed before is a two-step inversion process. This is actually showing 3 steps, but in general it's been a 2-step process. So you would go from your seismic amplitude domain, where you have your near, mid, and far stacks, and then you would use a traditional AVO or amplitude versus offset inversion algorithm to then go to the elastic properties. So that could be, for example, acoustic impedance, VPVS, and density that with some type of cost function is minimized. You would then go from these inverted elastic properties using a rock physics model. You could then do a rock physics inversion, for example, where you then produce volume of clay, porosity, and water saturation. Or you could actually go directly from these elastic properties to a lithology classification. So you can see that there's quite a few steps actually involved in going from our seismic amplitude domain to our end goal of a facies model. And it's really hard to propagate uncertainty through all of these different steps. So really the best case is if we can go directly from the seismic amplitude domain to our facies model. And that's exactly what a lot of these Bayesian inversion algorithms, and particularly what I'm talking about today in terms of DPI, tries to solve. So we don't go through the elastic domain or the reservoir properties either via a lithology classification or via a rock physics model. We actually go directly from the amplitude domain all the way to the facies model directly. And that produces our lithofacies and also probabilistic output of our actual elastic properties from the output facies model. So as I mentioned before, the kind of first thing I want to cover is the prior framework. So from that aspect, I'll start with looking at the actual facies. So as I mentioned, Bayesian methods are really nice and allow us to actually integrate broad sort of natural statements into our inversion problem. And they can be things like the younger rock is always above the older rock. They can be a gas saturated sand, for example, cannot exist below a brine saturated sand based on fluid gravitational ordering. We might know that a specific facies is expected to be much, much thinner than another facies, and we can use that information as well in our inversion problem. And also things like this facies can only transition to a specific other facies, or for example, if there's an unconformity, you know that a specific formation has to either go directly into another formation, potentially not chronologically. And basically what the really nice thing about these Bayesian inference problems is that if you can make a statement and it can be framed probabilistically, it can be used in construction of the prior for an inversion problem. The other component we also have is the prior on our elastic properties. And we can also integrate some prior beliefs into actually the geophysical rock properties of our facies. So for example, here you can see we've got 3 crossplots. We've got AI on the x-axis and VPVS on the y-axis of the first crossplot. The second, we have AI on the x and density on the y-axis. And the third crossplot, we have VPVS on the x and density on the y. The yellow colors are brine sands, the red colors are hydrocarbon sands, the blue colors you see here are cemented sands, and then we have some silts here and some shales. So a couple of things that we can introduce in terms of our model is we know that the elastic properties of a facies vary a lot. So for example, if we look at the shales, we can see that we have quite a wide distribution on our VPVS that we see in our shales. And maybe we also say we've got quite a wide distribution on our acoustic impedance. So we can use the data that we see from the wells, as well as supplementing with some knowledge that we have from other wells that could be outside of our seismic survey, to say that the range of elastic properties of this facies is a little bit wider than exactly what we sampled. We can also say that, for example, the sample-to-sample variation is very high in a facies. So what that means is that if you go from one sample point to another sample point, the elastic properties of that facies can vary quite significantly. So for example, if we look at the sand crossplot here on the right-hand side, we might have a particular VPVS and density at one sample point that might sit here, and then you go really far away to another point on that facies, and that could be the next the sample point. So that allows us to model heterogeneity of a facies as well. And when we actually undertake a probabilistic inversion project, we calculate the mean elastic properties and the variance covariances, so between the different elastic properties like AI, VPVS, and density from the well log data. But there's nothing at all stopping us from supplementing that with some other geological knowledge and changing those distributions. So the next component is talking about Markov chains, and that relates back to how we actually model our facies transitions. So if you're unfamiliar with Markov chains, basically what they do is just describe transitions between states probabilistically. So basically they say that the probability of transition to another state just depends on the current state that you're in. And when I say states, in our case, that just means facies. And these actually allow us to model plausible and broad sequences of facies that maybe we've encountered in the well logs, or we know that we could potentially encounter. So this is just an example of what a Markov chain may look like in terms of our facies and the power that it actually has in determining transitions between facies. So you can see here that the blue lines represent allowable transitions, and the grey lines represent transitions that can't happen. So for example, we know we can't transition from a brine sand to a gas sand based on fluid gravitational ordering, but we can transition, for example, from a gas sand to a shale. So even just including these fluid gravitational ordering rules constrains our solution space quite substantially. And that can also be represented in a transition probability matrix. And if you're unfamiliar with the transition probability matrix, all it states is the probability of going from this facies here on the row to the facies here on the column. So for example, you can see that if we go from this silt facies here, there is no probability that we can go from the silt facies to the overburden facies, obviously as the overburden sits above that silt at all times. And these transition probability matrices actually encode quite a substantial amount of information. So obviously it encodes our facies ordering, because we can say that the younger rocks, for example, have to be above the older rocks. We can also say that the gas sands have to be above the brine sands, for example. You can see that here encoded in our transition probability matrix as well. But it actually also encodes our facies thicknesses. So for example, if we look at this diagonal, this tells us about the probability of transitioning from that current facies to the same facies. So you can imagine that if you have a particularly thick facies, then you're going to have a really high probability of transitioning to that same facies in the next state. So these actual transition probability matrices encode a really quite large amount of information that again helps to actually constrain our solution space. So I know this flow chart looks a bit scary, but I'll run you through it. And this is basically just an overview of exactly how DPI works specifically. So we have our prior framework, which we've just discussed, which contains our Markov transition probability matrix, which just tells us about the allowable transitions between fascies. We have here our rock physics model, which is based on the well-log results to model the elastic properties of those fascies. And what we actually do is we use a sampling-based approach where we sample many different configurations of fascie sequences, which you can see here. And then we, from those fascie sequences, sample from the statistical rock physics models and produce the sampled elastic properties. And from that, we can then use our modeling operator, which would be the convolutional model with a wavelet, to produce a model of what the seismic may look like with a particular fascie sequence. So we then use this likelihood model. We localize the data, and I'll discuss this a little bit more in a further slide, but the localization basically is to help us overcome the curse of dimensionality that we typically see with these Bayesian inference problems. And the localization is basically a wavelet length around the sample that we're interested in. And that's because a lot of inverse problems say that all you can learn from your particular sample is based on the wavelet, a wavelet length around that particular sample. So we can use Bayes' theorem, which just states that the probability of having this fascie sequence, given the data, is proportional to the probability of the data coming from the fascie sequence that we're looking at, multiplied by our prior probability of actually having that fascies. We then integrate that and we actually come out with a marginal posterior. And all the posterior means is that it's the prior which has been exposed to our data to give us a posterior prediction. And that gives us the probability of having all the fascies at every sample point. So constructing the likelihood model is actually a very important step in a lot of Bayesian inference problems. And particularly for DPI, we take a sampling-based approach to constructing the likelihood. So what we do is we take a particular sequence of fascies. So in this case, we've got a fascies length of 7. And then what we do is we extend these fascie sequences based on the Markov probability matrix that you saw in the previous slide, based on those rules. And we do this for a lot of different iterations. So you get a lot of samples of different fascie sequences. And these are conditioned obviously by the smaller sequence. So you can see here that if we look at each of these fascie sequences, they consistently have a brine sand, they've got the oil sand and then the gas sand. So basically what I mean by conditioned is that all of these sequences depend on this group of 7 fascies in the middle. And then what's actually done is we can use the statistical rock physics model to then produce realizations for each of these fascie sequences of the elastic properties, and then use the convolutional model to come up with a model of what our seismic data may look like based on these fascie sequences. And what that looks like is basically a really high dimensional Gaussian probability function that states what the probability of having seismic is given the fascie sequence. So like any good neighborhood watch, we really care about what's around us, and that is certainly the case in this direct probabilistic inversion. So the localization really helps control the curse of dimensionality that we typically see with Bayesian inversion problems. You can imagine that if you have 1,000 sample length trace, if you want to invert a full length trace, for example, and you had 10 fascies per sample, you could potentially have, if you didn't have any ordering rules, an immense amount of different fascies combinations. So this is really the strength in being able to actually have this run in finite time, is that we solve a lot of smaller inverse problems rather than solving one very large inverse problem. So what we have is our seismic grid, for example, and then we focus on one cell and we'll call that cell alpha. We then have our fascies region B around that cell alpha, which is the small fascies window that you saw in the previous slide here, and that's just parameterized by a particular length. So in this case, it was 7. And then what we have is the elastic domain region, which we denote as E. And basically what the elastic domain region is the elastic properties which we know will affect the seismic data in the region D around our cell alpha. So region D is just half a wavelength on either side around cell alpha, whereas E is a full wavelength either side of alpha, because we know the elastic properties in this region will affect the data that we see in this region. So this localization really helps to actually solve this problem in finite time rather than trying to solve it for a full trace. So now I'm going into the synthetic data examples, and I just thought I'd start with a quick caveat that, of course, synthetic data is no substitute for real data, but it is really nice to actually test the corner cases of the algorithm and extreme cases. For example, if we have no noise or lots of contaminated noise in the seismic data. And a point here is I'm not trying to convince you it's good. I'm just trying to show you that the algorithm actually works for our synthetic cases. So here's quite an extreme example. We have two fascies here. One is darker blue and one's a lighter blue color. And then from this, we actually produce these are the elastic property traces from these fascies. So we've got AI, VPVS, and density. And then we've got the same visualization here in the track plots, but on the cross plots for AI, VPVS, we've got density AI, and we've got density VPVS. So you can see that we've got two fascies that are absolutely identical in terms of their means. They've got identical distributions for each of the properties. So the covariance matrices are identical. But the one thing that's different between them, and you might actually be able to see this on the traces, is that they have a different spatial correlation length. So that just means that the properties of the blue fascies above can actually change more sample to sample than the lighter color fascies in light blue. So basically it can move around more sample to sample in this cross plot. So this is obviously a very extreme example, but one which DPI solves quite nicely. So this is that exact same plot with our synthetic seismic data now generated from these elastic property traces. And then once we go through the probabilistic inversion, and I should note that the prior for this problem was just a 50-50 split of having this fascies versus this fascies. You can actually see that we exactly recover the fascies model that produced this seismic data, even in the case of exactly the same distributions and means. The only thing changing was the elastic property correlation sample to sample. So the actual algorithm we've shown matches numerically exactly the Metropolis Hastings Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm, but it actually outperforms Metropolis Hastings by several orders of magnitude because Metropolis Hastings just searches the whole solution space. The next sort of extreme example is looking at how we handle noise, and particularly how noise affects our data where we have highly ambiguous fascies and with very thin fascies. So we've got a fascies trace here, which has in yellow, which is brine sands. We've got gas sands in this sort of grey blue color. In red, we've got oil sands, and then we've got shales and silts. And this is what the realized elastic properties look like for this fascies trace. We've got acoustic impedance, we've got VPVS, and we've got density. And we can see also what that looks like in crossplot space, AI here on the x-axis and VPVS on the y-axis. You can see that we've got quite nice separation between our gas sand and oil sand. Our brine sand varies quite a bit more than those two oil and gas sands. But then you can see our shales and silts basically overlay each other in elastic property space. You can also see that we've got a lot of thin fascies that are basically below tuning thickness. And what we actually want to test is if we contaminate our synthetic seismic data generated from these elastic property models with correlated noise. So that is noise that depends on the sample before it. How does the actual direct probabilistic inversion method handle those noise levels? So current methods would basically fail because the beds are too thin to be correctly classified. And with all these interbedded fascies, you basically get a mean package response in your elastic properties. And so you really need to have the prior information of the potential fascie sequences and their thicknesses to be able to constrain the solution space even further. So here's an example of the noise case. So we've got our seismic data, we've got this mean synthetic generated from the probabilistic inversion, and then we've got the residuals, and you can see there's absolutely zero residuals because we exactly model the input seismic. And if we look at the posterior, so this is just our prior after it's been exposed to the seismic data through the likelihood model. The most probable, so this is calculated from the posterior, and then we've got the observed fascies. And this is the same as the fascies tracing you saw in the previous slide. And you can see that the most probable exactly matches the observed fascies that we see in the noise case. So this is just a nice test to see that when we have an extreme example of noise synthetic, we should be able to exactly reproduce the input fascies. So then I moved to a white noise model, which is completely uncorrelated and random trace to trace. And you can see that the big issues that we have with the white noise model is that it starts to challenge the thin bed resolution is one thing. And then it starts to become quite challenging in places of elastic ambiguity. So for example, where we have our shales and then we've got our silts, you can see that we start to get poorer results. But you can see that generally our oil sands, our gas sands and our brine sands, we still do quite a nice job, even when we actually specify the incorrect noise model for what noise has actually been added to the seismic data. So now when we go and actually specify what we call a low pass filter noise model, so it's just been band limited to actually the seismic bandwidth, and this noise is actually typically a lot harder to remove from your seismic data. You can see that we actually get an uplift in our inversion results when we specify the correct noise model. So basically what this is saying is that if we have information about our actual noise levels in our seismic data, and we can correctly specify that in the inversion problem, you can see that we actually get a substantial uplift in our inversion results relative to an incorrect model. So for example, you can see we get back those really thin sands and shales. And we also, we do still struggle a bit, you can see, with the elastic ambiguity, and that's always going to be challenged by noise. And then the next scenario is going to the very, very noisy case. You can see that obviously we've got a lot of residuals. Again, we struggle with correctly classifying shales and silts because we know they're so ambiguous in elastic crossplot space. But again, you can see that even in the very noisy case where we specify an incorrect noise model, we nicely get these gas sands and also some of the gas and oil sands down deep. And that's just a function of them being so different in elastic crossplot space. And then again, if we go to the low pass filter noise model, which is what the low pass filter noise is what the data is actually being contaminated with, you can see that it substantially improves the predictions and we now correctly get, again, these sands with the interbedded silts, as well as the gas sand on top of the oil sand here, which we don't get in the white noise model case. So basically, the summary from this is that noise definitely challenges thin bed resolution, and it also is very challenging when you have elastically ambiguous fascies. But if we can get decent estimates of the noise level, as well as what type of noise exists in the data, we can actually get substantial uplifts in our inversion results relative to not actually specifying a noise model. So we're finally getting into some real data examples. So this is from the Cooper-Eromanga Basin in Australia. It's a stacked Jurassic Age sandstone reservoir, and it's been deposited in marine or a low energy fluvial environment. It's quite a challenging data set in that a lot of the fascies are at or below seismic resolution, and there's a varying calcite amount, which is known to quite substantially distort the signal and makes it quite challenging to invert. So the data that we actually have is we've got 8 angle stacks from 5 to 40 degrees. We have P wave and S wave sonic logs. We've got a density log. We've got the typical petrophysical log suite of volume of clay, water saturation and porosity. And we have 4 regional interpreted horizons. And I think this type of received data is probably standard for what we would expect for a probabilistic inversion project. The only other thing we might need is, for example, a lithology log. So this is just a nice challenge for all the really good seismic interpreters out there, because I'm definitely not one of them. Here's a near incidence angle stack, and here's a far incidence angle stack. And I'll just give you the challenge now and just have a think about it. Where would you pick the horizons in this region where this arrow is covering? There's a couple of events in there that you maybe could pick through, but I definitely don't think I would personally be confident in doing it. So just going back to how we actually go and construct the framework, we have our rock physics prior, which is based off our well log. So we've got, this is our actual data, which you saw previously in AI, VPVS, AI density, and VPVS density. And just to note that color saturation changes with depth. So we do capture the depth trends by having formation specific fascies. And this is actually the output from our statistical rock physics model. So you can see that we really nicely capture both the mean of the elastic properties for each of the fascies and also the distributions of these. And what we tend to do is extend the distributions a little bit further than what we sample in the well log, because obviously we know that the wells have only sampled a small part of our subsurface. So we want to be a little bit more broad in terms of our elastic property distribution. So now we go and look at our prior probability field. So here's an example on the left of what a prior probability field may look like. So we've got our volume of clay log in green, we've got our porosity log in blue, we've got our water saturation log in red. This track here in the middle is the observed fascies. So green shales, red we have hydrocarbon sands, the yellow is brine sands, and the blue is actually cemented sands, which are known to be sub-seismic resolution. And then we've got our actual prior probability field, which you can see is very smooth, and this should sum to 1. So for example, in this zone in the middle, we've got approximately maybe 50% prior probability of shale, we've got 30% maybe prior probability of sand, and then we've got very small prior probabilities of hydrocarbon sand and cemented sand. So you can see in general, we know that the cemented sands and hydrocarbon sands are rare events. So we tend to not place a high prior probability of these events happening. And you can see that prior field also going from 1D to a 2D section. You can see that this is actually the prior probability for a shale. So the lighter it is, the less the probability is. And then the darker it is, the higher the probability is. So you can see that in general, the prior probability for the shales is very smooth. And we don't put a lot of input bias into the problem at the start. We then go and feed it through the inversion algorithm, and now you can see that in yellow is now the posterior prediction of where the shales might be. So you can see that even in that really challenging dim zone, we've picked out a really nice continuous fascies prediction for the shale, and it's also quite certain as well. And that's without putting in a really high prior probability of that fascies actually occurring. And you can also see what the posterior prediction looks like in an example well. So you can see that now we've obviously got a lot more information than our prior. So our seismic data is telling us something about the expected fascies that we should see. And one really nice outcome of this data set was actually that the cemented sands, which you can see here in blue, these are very thin and below seismic resolution. And some of these cemented sands we actually pick out quite nicely in our posterior probabilities. And just another view of how you maybe might visualize posterior fascies probabilities. So here we've got, in different colors again, we've got green representing shales, we've got yellow representing brine sand, red representing oil sand, and blue representing cemented sand. And they vary in shades or saturations of that color based on how certain the prediction is. So this is a most likely volume. And you can see that it's very obvious the power of the spatial rules. So for example, you can see that we've got oil sands here on top of brine sands, and we'll never have these wormholes that we might see in lithology classification, where you might get a brine sand on top of an oil sand and then a brine sand again. You can see that it's very geological and it has very nice structure in the inversion results. So back to the horizon challenge that I gave to everyone a couple of slides earlier. What we can actually do is we can reformulate the problem. Rather than trying to solve for the Fashi's predictions, we can actually try to solve for the expected transitions in Fashi's, and that would give us these surfaces, so horizons, for example. So here on the left, we've got the same track plot that you saw before with the different petrophysical logs. We've got now the prior probability of having a formation transition here. We've got the posterior prediction, and then we also see that in the 2D plots. You can see we've got our prior surface probability, so the prior probability of actually having a formation transition. And then we've got the posterior surface probabilities. So you can see in that really dim section you saw on both the near and far stacks, we've got a really continuous high probability event that's telling us that we're very likely to have some type of transition in this zone. And then we actually go and look and compare the posterior Fashi's transition prediction to the well log data. You can see, particularly in this middle section here, the black bars being actual interpreted tops from the well log data. You can see that those predictions from the seismic match up really nicely to the interpreted tops in the wells. So one other data example, so this is not land data now, this is a marine data set. This is a comparison to, I guess, what would be the typical lithology classification from a deterministic inversion. So one of the outcomes from this was that we saw in the litho class that the sands were over-predicted. We were pretty good at classifying the basal coals, but we saw that a lot of the intraformation coals, which are generally quite thin, we missed quite a lot of those in the lithology classification. So what was found by the client was that with the direct probabilistic inversion, we had less overprediction of sands, we had well-resolved fluids, and the basal coals and thinner, shallower coals were also well-resolved. So this is just an example of what these seismic data actually look like for one of the angle stacks. We've got our wells overlain here, which you can see, and then we've also got the Fashi's logs. So these black, and I'm going to be focusing on the coals here, where we have the coals within the well logs. And the basal coal tends to be substantially thicker than what we see from the intra formation coals. So now if I just go back and forth a couple of times, this is what the prediction was from the two-step lithology classification. So generally you can see it was actually, the basal coal in this section was actually pretty nicely predicted. But you can see, particularly on the upper section, that sands were generally quite over-predicted in some places. But generally, it was actually quite a nice result from the lithology classification. Then if we go and, this is zoomed in section where you can see that the basal coals, again, we predict quite nicely. But this intra-formation coal you can see up here, we do struggle with resolving. We generally predict it as either a shale, sometimes a silt. Then we go, and I'll flip back, and then here again, this is now the direct probabilistic inversion results. You can see that the basal coals are now much more laterally continuous. And if I zoom in here, you can actually see that the intra-formation coals, which are really thin, you can see we have a really nice laterally continuous coal here. And I should say that the DPI algorithm is 1D, so there's no sort of horizontal constraint on having a particular Fashi's based on the current Fashi's. So this is obviously really nice to see that we've got horizontally continuous predictions of coal, which the client thought was quite a substantial uplift to what they saw in the previous lithology classification. And then we can also see what that actually looks like at the well logs again. So we've got the volume of shale, porosity, and water saturation logs here. We've got the actual Fashi's log in red, hydrocarbon sands, black, we've got coals, green is shale, and then the yellow is actually brine sand. You can see our prior fascies probability, we try to be as unbiased as possible. And you can see our posterior fascies probability predictions show substantial increases in the probability of having a hydrocarbon sand where it was expected in these two intervals. And actually what's really interesting in this case is that we've got a very thin coal, and you can see our posterior fascies probability increases quite substantially in the presence of this coal. So that was really nice to see that we could even discriminate units which were substantially below tuning thickness. So as a summary, Bayesian inversion methods really allow us to integrate domain-specific information into our inversion problem much better and in a much more natural way. We don't have to just stick to a low-frequency model and try to add information into that. We can actually do it through probabilistic statements instead. So the prior framework allows capturing of what we see in the well logs, so the fascie-specific statistics, but we can also extend these based on prior knowledge from from geologists, for example, on what the expected fascie transitions may be in other areas, or also what the expected elastic property distributions may be. So localization of the inversion problem is really crucial in obtaining feasible runtimes. If you try to do this for an entire trace, it would quickly explode in runtimes. So the localization is very important, and I think doing it via wavelet lengths is a really natural way of applying it in an inversion problem. So overlapping fascies as well in the elastic domain, we can handle that by adding some extra information that we don't have in a typical deterministic inversion, such as fascies ordering, as well as fascies thickness distributions. And also we saw that even we know our seismic data isn't perfect, but knowledge of this imperfection can really help us to improve inversion results. And as you saw in the last example, we've seen uplift compared to standard lithology classification from simultaneous avion inversion with DPI.